Yeah, I'm Brian. I'm an artist. I want to thank the organizers for this and all of you. I think it's a really meaningful effort to make a conference like this happen. I'm going to go off in a little bit of a different direction and offer more or less a short meditation on a theme here. And if you're disturbed by rats, now would be a good time to look away, like right now.
I think this definitely is the right size for the collar. Yeah.
How did you do this by yourself?
With adrenaline. Okay. So here we go. Under the chin is the tough part. Here we go. Now we want it centered on the back. And then we're going to pull, but not too tight. That's not, see, I think that's a little loose.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So here I am with Dr. Michael Parsons from Fordham University at an undisclosed location in Brooklyn. This is a wild, in the urban sense, female Norway rat that we caught using a standard trap and some peanuts. She's sedated here with a mixture of oxygen and 3% isoflurane coming out of the face mask. And this one weighs about, 380 grams, which is full grown for New York City rat, although they can get up into the 500s. Norway rats can carry a collar that's up to 10% of their body weight, so this is definitely large enough for this collar, which is less than 10 grams, and has been approved by the IACUC, which is the Animal Ethics Committee. In that collar is a Wi-Fi transmitter linked to a nearby base station, and just to note that the blinking is a connection indicator, which will turn off once things get started. That collar is a prototype we've developed that streams accelerometer data at around 100 hertz, which lets us get fine-grained activity data. So when you classify that with machine learning, it allows us to distinguish particular behaviors. So your kind of standard ethogram from biological studies, eating, sleeping, mating, fighting, etc. And this is actually an actual signal you're watching here. It can also measure proximity to the base station and to other collared rats via a mesh network for social analysis, although thus far that's pretty much more in principle than in practice. All of this is collaborative work that's funded by the Tau Center at Columbia that also includes Marguerite Holloway from the Journalism School and the biologist Jason Munchie-South from Fordham. But just to back up a little bit, this is Derrida and his cat, who he named Logos. So the cat is famous because of an incident where, Derrida is standing there in his bathroom naked or whatever, and the cat looks at him, and he looks back, and it prompts this, long reflection on the threshold of the difference between the animal and the human. And it kind of comes down to this distinction between what is just an instinctual reaction when encountering the other, and what is a conscious response to the other. So for other philosophers like Lacan, that difference comes down to language, right? But we can kind of guess that since Derrida named his cat Logos, he thinks it's a little bit more of a complicated issue. And it's not just whether the animal has some kind of language, but if the human is really capable of something more than a reaction, and how exactly you would determine that difference. So in any case, Derrida and the cat are standing there staring at each other, both apex predators, right? And the one thing you cannot do with a wild rat is look it in the eye. So even more so if you trap one, right? So if you stare at it through the cage, there's actually a danger that it could die of cardiac arrest for fear of being predated. So you have to cover the cage with a blanket or a pillowcase or something. So the rat that lives in our cities isn't exactly a companion species in the sense that the dog or the cat share our lives and look us in the face, even though they're totally ever present. And so social networks, based on the face being legible, already obscure possible ways to think about participation by what runs away or what enters where it's not supposed to belong, even when that possibility is foundational to such infrastructure. So you could argue that rats, in fact, are constitutive of what makes us human. This is actually another prototype at the lab, and we're filming to try to establish a baseline of different behavioral signatures. That's hard because on some level, these are different animals, right? Albino lab rats descend from a common ancestor who is very much a pet. But rats, well, the funny thing is that rats aren't really used very often to study rats, right? And in fact, here we had to use used rats for this, saving them, after they had done their duty in the laboratory, we had to save them from retirement in the Blade Runner sense of the word. But animal experimentation means that these guys keep showing up in our technology, right? Just like rats in the building. They render it animal-like, even if we think our technological sophistication is something that renders us human. Yeah, so for example, this is a rat using Facebook. Back in the 1930s, B.F. Skinner was more or less interested in how habits develop, right? And recently, Wendy Chun has written extensively on habits in relation to life online. And she notes that habits are learned, not instinctual. They are embodied in our actions that have become unconscious, and that the accumulation of habits is central to our personality, subjectivity, and even to ideology. And the issue here is not that the rat is going to get bored with this arrangement, right? It's that the computer will. It needs to find some other dependency with which to afflict its subject. So, if the way that we move is ideology, that's something to think about. And I'm glad that we have a solution for this, but I'm still curious about what created the problem. Applications of wearable technology have made me a little obsessed with accelerometers, right? Because there's this point of contact where the body is incorporated into digital networks. And it's a really rich signal to try and colonize, right? Because the style of how the body moves encodes physiology, it encodes personality, and it encodes the socioeconomic enculturation that we all go through depending on how we've been specifically positioned in society. So the fact that neoliberal surveillance platforms are getting hip to the rhythms of the body, that's exciting because now this tech is super cheap, right? Our circuit costs less than $10 to produce, all included. We've messed around with Bluetooth versions and also Wi-Fi using the ESP8266 chip, which I'm sure a lot of you are excited about. And for now, we're just using a regular triple axis accelerometer because it's really, again, that signature of movement that we're interested in, not the absolute specifics of any particular motion. This stuff is cheap now in wearable tech, but of course, working with accelerometer data, systems like this has been around in experimental music for decades, which is where I'm coming from originally. That's no accident, right? Because of course, music is exactly that. It's audible human motion. This chart is from Vijay Iyer, who's one of my favorite musicians and also thinkers. And he's breaking down these levels of bodily motion and their correspondence with rhythmic strata in music. So there's nothing about music that transcends bodily knowledge. It's an aestheticization and an intensification of just that. And, oh yeah, we don't want to hear that. I bring up music probably because that's technically the field that I'm studying at the moment, but the connection is not a specious one. Because since audible motion is motion in contact with something, it's necessarily technological. So a sonic epistemology can open things up here. It's obvious that the range in which we hear tends to correspond with the scale of the movements that we regularly make. It follows then, arguably, that the mechanical, in the sense of moving, apparatuses that we create to intersect with our bodies tend to make sound we can hear. This is a recording of the urban soundscape around Columbus Park in downtown Manhattan from a month or so ago. There's a fair amount of stuff going on, as we expect. So now this is the exact same recording, but I've filtered out everything over 20 kilohertz, which is the upper limit of human hearing. Not much going on there. So I'm going to play that exact same sound that I just played, at least a portion of it, but I'm going to play it 24 times slower. So that was rat networking. To my knowledge, these are the first recordings of wild rats in New York City at this frequency range. Although I did learn that the sound artist Janne Winderen has made similar recordings in Oslo, which kind of makes sense since they're Norway rats, even though Norway rats aren't actually from Norway, but whatever. But the trick with this is that I didn't use an ordinary microphone, right? It's an ultrasonic electret with a sampling rate that's high enough so that I could slow it down low enough that you could hear it. I'm recording onto an SD card using a Raspberry Pi and a power pack so I can get it up to 48 hours at a time. And it's inside a rat trap, which of course has nothing to do with the rats. It's so that I can leave it out in public and the humans won't mess with it. We're conditioned to ignore certain types of infrastructure. Hi, Ingrid. So here's a spectrogram of rat vocalizations where you can see what's going on in that spectrum that we just heard. So the red line is 20 kilohertz, and below it you see all the human shit, voices, cars going by, etc. And up here, all the way up to 96 kilohertz, is pretty wide open for the rats. And I'll argue that has something to do with the fact that they're there. So compare that spectrogram to this one. It's the recording I made with Nat Geo in Botswana's Okavango Delta. This is a conventional microphone, so here the range is pretty much all audible to us. But I show it because it's a pretty clear demonstration of what Bernie Krause calls the niche hypothesis, which is the sound of an ecosystem self-organizes into frequency bands. So from the top down, in these different strata, we have various species of insects, then birds, frogs, large mammals, etc., who are all sensitive to, just a particular sonic layer. And that allows everyone to communicate without speaking over each other, and causing the type of disaster that happened with the Titanic, etc. And of course, in music, this is the same kind of spectral layering that happens with different instruments. It's also, that we learned yesterday, isomorphic to this partitioning of the spectrum in radio. The difference, of course, is that the biophony doesn't have a regulatory body, right? It depends on our being sensitive to each other. So we can only hear the very lowest tones that a rat might make, right? Which are the squeaks that it makes when it's angry or in fear or in pain. And that's pretty much the affect that we tend to ascribe to rats. But it's worth noting that rats also can't hear us very well. So 200 hertz is their lower limit, and the fundamental pitches of most human voices is beneath that. So we inhabit these different timescales of movement in more ways than one, and it shows up in the soundscape. And I guess the goal of a recording like that is to shift the frequencies such that we respond differently to the rat, right? It gives us this sense of the voice of the animal, not to ventriloquize it with words, but to hear the utter unintelligibility of a voice that is nonetheless a voice like our own, and speaking on our same spaces. It's a different thing than, for example, this. So the media theorist Akira Lippert defines modernity both by the disappearance of wildlife from humanity's habitat and by the reappearance of the same in humanity's reflection on itself, particularly in film. So it's a coping mechanism, more or less, for our own animality. Sorry, I had to put that in there. But these things are disgusting or hilarious when they're uncomfortable and we don't know who is imitating whom, right? But whose clickbait was this? So new media today is about the platform, right? Not the content. So it's the invisible rat that's the more meaningful inhabitant of our networks, the one that shapes our epistemology of data collection. And this is the recursion that drew me to this kind of absurd collar project, that it's the behavioralist tendencies of the contemporary surveillance economy that end up making it possible to learn about rats, but significantly rats outside of the lab. So, as I said, the wild urban rat is surprisingly understudied, right? The rat is an animal for its own sake, precisely because I think they are a little too close for comfort. So one, what can the scientists learn about the animal itself from a straight up kind of scientific perspective? But two, more interestingly, what does it take in terms of zoomorphism to build a rat bit, right? And what story will that allow us to tell? And three, does that let us engineer a rat encounter, like in the recordings, that's more honest about our own position in networks, and which might challenge our epistemologies? This is our testing procedure in Riverside Park. He's got a collar in his sock. And obviously there's a different set of concerns, right, regarding the topology of radio reception when we're talking about rat motion. And also the park is not the subway, which is not the curbside garbage buffet. And of course this methodology is a little ad hoc here, right? But moments like these were what most interest me, when there's a little bit of a becoming animal involved. So as it turns out, of course, radio reception is really hard with rats. We decrease the resolution on the device depending on network availability, and we sleep the ESP whenever the animal is sleeping, or if we're out of range and have used up all the internal cache. We use the accelerometer to hit the wake pin to get things started again as necessary. But with all that, still, battery life is a big issue. Using Wi-Fi is more robust than Bluetooth, but then getting more than a couple days out of this isn't possible at this point. Which of course then that means that collar design has to make sure that they're eventually going to be able to get out of those things, even if we don't succeed in retrapping them. So it's ongoing work. Here's one outcome we're working on though. It's a bracelet for humans. So perform the same kind of tracking on both the human and the rat at once, and let the human know what the rat was up to. Right, i.e. kind of vibrate the bracelet whenever the rat happens to do something interesting. And so from that, let's just see where this kind of mediated intimacy sits between a reaction and a response. Thank you.